The sheriff's whip hung suspended in the air as Elizabeth's voice sliced through the bloodthirsty crowd. "Don't hurt him, I'll buy him." In the Apache warrior's obsidian eyes, she saw not the savage they feared, but a dignity worth risking everything to save. Before we continue, don't forget to subscribe to the channel, like the video, and comment where in the world you're watching from. Let's go. The sun bore down on Broken Ridge with merciless intensity, turning the dusty main street into a shimmering mirage of heat. It was the kind of summer day when sensible folks stayed indoors, yet the town square was packed with bodies, the air thick with sweat and anticipation. Elizabeth Hartwell pushed through the crowd, her cotton dress clinging to her back, strands of auburn hair escaping her usually tidy bun. She had only meant to visit the general store for supplies before returning to her small schoolhouse on the edge of town. The commotion had drawn her like a moth to flame. "Make way for justice!" Sheriff Thornton's voice boomed over the murmuring crowd. "Let this be a lesson to any savage who thinks to defy the United States government." Elizabeth stood on tiptoes to see over the wall of shoulders. There, in the center of the gathering, stood a man unlike any she had seen before, tall and copper-skinned, with midnight hair that hung in two long braids, adorned with feathers and bone. Despite the heavy chains binding his wrists and ankles, he stood straight as an arrow, eyes fixed on some distant point beyond the jeering faces. "This Apache refused reservation life 3 times, Thornton continued, circling the prisoner like a wolf. "Raided 2 settlements, killed white men." "Hang him!" someone shouted. "Whip him first!" cried another. The prisoner's expression never changed. Not defiant, Elizabeth thought, but something else entirely. Dignified, as if he existed on a plane above this human spectacle. "What's his name?" Elizabeth found herself asking, though she hadn't meant to speak aloud. An old trader standing nearby spat tobacco juice into the dust. "They call him Nakohe, means wild eagle in their tongue. Army's been chasing him for months." Nakohe. The name resonated in Elizabeth's mind like the toll of a distant bell. Sheriff Thornton removed his hat and wiped sweat from his brow. "By the authority vested in me by the territory of Arizona, I sentence this Indian to 20 lashes, to be administered immediately." A deputy stepped forward, unfurling a whip with practiced ease. The leather tongue coiled in the dirt like a desert snake. Elizabeth felt something crack inside her chest. 2 years a widow in this hard land had taught her to keep her opinions to herself, to accept the harsh realities of frontier justice, to look away when necessary. But she could not look away now. "Wait!" The word tore from her throat before reason could contain it. Her heart hammered against her ribs as every head turned in her direction. The crowd parted, leaving her exposed. She stepped forward on legs that threatened to buckle. "Mrs. Hartwell?" Sheriff Thornton frowned. "This ain't no place for a lady teacher. You best get on home." Elizabeth swallowed hard. Nakohe's dark eyes had found hers, unfathomable as a midnight lake. "Don't hurt him," she said, her voice steadier than she felt. I'll buy him." A ripple of disbelief passed through the crowd, followed by laughter. "Buy him?" Thornton's mouth twisted. "Ma'am, this ain't a slave auction. This here's a dangerous Apache." "I understand that." She straightened her shoulders, channeling the authority she used with unruly schoolchildren. "But surely a fine would serve justice better than a public whipping. I have money, my late husband's savings, $200. The sheriff's eyebrows shot up. That was a substantial sum in a town where most families lived on less than $5 a week. "And what exactly would you do with a wild Indian, Mrs. Hartwell?" His voice dripped with mockery. "Teach him his letters?" More laughter, crueler now. "My property needs work," she replied evenly. "The schoolhouse roof leaks, the fence needs mending. I require labor I cannot perform myself." It was a practical explanation, though she scarcely believed it herself. Something else had propelled her forward. something in the man's unwavering dignity that stirred a forgotten part of her soul. Nakohe watched this exchange with no change in expression, yet Elizabeth sensed his attention was now fixed entirely on her. "Call him wild if you want," someone shouted from the back. "She's buying herself trouble." The sheriff studied her face for a long moment. Then he glanced at Nakohe, then back to Elizabeth. Something calculating passed behind his eyes. "Well now," he drawled, "ain't that an interesting proposition?" Sheriff Thornton stroked his mustache, considering Elizabeth's offer with the deliberation of a man who suddenly saw unexpected advantage. The crowd had gone eerily quiet, their collective breath held in suspense. 300, Thornton counted, paid to the county for damages and expenses incurred in his capture. Elizabeth's stomach clenched. $300 was nearly everything Thomas had left her, but she nodded without hesitation. "Done." Murmurs rippled through the crowd. A woman near the front, Agatha Pembroke, wife of the town banker, hissed, "Have you lost your mind, Elizabeth? That savage will slit your throat the first night." Elizabeth ignored her, focusing instead on the sheriff, who was now grinning like a man who'd just won at cards with a poor hand. "Very well, Mrs. Hartwell." He pulled a ring of keys from his belt. "But understand this, his crimes ain't forgiven, just commuted. He'll be your responsibility. Any trouble, and he'll swing from the nearest tree." Thornton's eyes hardened. "And trust me, there are plenty who'd welcome the excuse." He signaled to his deputies, who flanked Nakohe on either side, hands on their pistols. The Apache remained impassive, but Elizabeth noticed how his eyes tracked every movement, calculating, assessing. "You'll need to come by my office to sign the papers and pay the fine," Thornton said, "and I suggest you figure out how to control your new property." The word hung in the air like a thundercloud. Elizabeth flinched inwardly but kept her face composed. "I'll collect him this afternoon," she said, her voice steadier than her heartbeat. As she turned to leave, she caught sight of Reverend Collins watching from the edge of the crowd, disappointment etched in the lines of his face. Once, not long ago, she had considered his gentle courtship with something like relief, a respectable widower offering a secure future. Now, his look of dismay told her that possibility had likely evaporated like morning dew under the Arizona sun. By the time Elizabeth returned to the sheriff's office, the sun had begun its descent toward the western hills. She had spent the intervening hours at the bank withdrawing nearly all her savings, and at home preparing the small shed behind her schoolhouse for its unexpected occupant. Sheriff Thornton pushed a document across his desk. "This here says you accept full responsibility for the Indian known as Nakohe, or Wild Eagle. Also states you'll ensure he doesn't escape or cause harm." Elizabeth signed her name with fingers that trembled only slightly. "One more thing," Thornton added, folding the money into a lockbox. "County's providing these." He tossed a set of iron manacles onto the desk. "For your protection." "That won't be necessary," Elizabeth said, though uncertainty fluttered in her chest. Thornton shrugged. "Suit yourself. But don't say I didn't warn you when you wake up scalped." Nakohe was brought from the cells at the back, his hands still shackled, though the leg irons had been removed. Up close, he was even more imposing. Tall enough that Elizabeth had to tilt her head to meet his eyes, with shoulders broadened by a lifetime of physical hardship. His face bore the thin white line of an old scar across one cheekbone, and his eyes, deep brown and unfathomable, seemed to look through her rather than at her. "You understand English?" she asked quietly. A long pause, then a single, almost imperceptible nod. "My name is Elizabeth Hartwell. I'm taking you to my property outside town." She spoke slowly, unsure how much he comprehended. "You will work for me, and in exchange you won't be whipped or imprisoned." "He understands well enough," Thornton interjected. Army says he picked up English from some missionary or other. Don't be fooled by the silent act. Outside, a small crowd had gathered to witness Nakohe's release into Elizabeth's custody. She felt their eyes boring into her back as she led him toward her wagon, a mixture of curiosity, disapproval, and barely concealed hostility. Nakohe moved with the fluid grace of a mountain lion, despite his bonds. He climbed onto the wagon seat without assistance, his face a mask of stone. As Elizabeth flicked the reins and her old mare pulled away from the hitching post, she heard a voice call out, "Good luck with your wild man, Mrs. Hartwell. Hope he's housebroken." Laughter followed them out of town, and Elizabeth's cheeks burned with humiliation. She cast a sideways glance at her passenger, wondering what she had gotten herself into. Nakohe stared straight ahead, his profile carved against the setting sun like something ancient and immovable. Between them stretched a silence as vast as the desert itself. The wagon rattled over the rough trail, leading away from Broken Ridge, each jolt marking the growing distance between Elizabeth and everything familiar. The schoolhouse sat a mile outside town, close enough to be considered part of the community, but far enough that she enjoyed a measure of privacy that now seemed both blessing and curse. No neighbors would be within earshot if she screamed. Elizabeth pushed the morbid thought away. She had made her choice, impulsive though it was, and she would not surrender to fear. As the wagon crested the final rise, her modest homestead came into view. A simple one-room schoolhouse with her small attached living quarters, a barn barely deserving of the name, and the shed she had hastily prepared. She cleared her throat. "That's where I teach," she said, pointing to the weathered clapboard building, "and where I live." Nakohe gave no indication he had heard her. His gaze swept the property in a careful assessment that missed nothing. The broken fence line, the garden patch struggling against the arid soil, the leaking roof with its missing shingles. Elizabeth saw her home through his eyes and felt a flush of embarrassment at its disrepair. "My husband built it 3 years ago," she continued, more to fill the silence than from any expectation of response, "before the fever took him." She guided the mare to a halt near the water trough and set the brake. Without waiting for assistance, Nakohe descended from the wagon with the same fluid grace that had marked his movements in town. The chains at his wrists clinked softly. Elizabeth fumbled in her pocket for the key Sheriff Thornton had given her. "I'll remove those now," she said, approaching him with caution. Nakohe extended his hands, and for the first time, Elizabeth noticed the raw, reddened skin beneath the iron. The manacles had been too tight, chafing his wrists with each movement. A wave of shame washed over her, not for anything she had done, but for being part of a world that could inflict such casual cruelty. Her fingers trembled as she inserted the key. The lock clicked, and the shackles fell away. Nakohe rubbed his wrists, his eyes meeting hers with an intensity that made her breath catch. "Thank you," he said, his voice deep and unexpectedly smooth, though rough from disuse. Elizabeth started at the sound, nearly dropping the key. "You do speak English." "When necessary." His accent was slight, the words carefully formed. An awkward silence fell between them. Elizabeth gestured toward the shed. "You'll stay there. It's not much, but I put in a pallet and some blankets. There's water in the basin for washing." Nakohe followed her gaze, but made no move toward the shed. Instead, his attention returned to the broken fence, the listing gate, the patched roof. "You said you needed work done," he stated. "Yes." Elizabeth nodded, surprised by his directness. "The roof leaks when it rains. The fence needs mending. The garden requires attention." She hesitated. "And winter will come sooner than we think. I will begin tomorrow." It wasn't a question or an offer, just a simple statement of fact. Elizabeth nodded again, unsure what else to say. This exchange, brief as it was, had thrown her off balance. She had expected resistance, perhaps even hostility, not this calm acceptance. "Are you hungry?" she asked. "I can bring food to your quarters. I will eat what you provide." His gaze shifted beyond her, toward the distant mountains that burned copper in the setting sun. Elizabeth retreated to her kitchen, grateful for the familiar task of preparing a meal. She sliced bread from the loaf she'd baked that morning, added dried beef, an apple, and a cup of water. Simple fare, but the best she could offer on short notice. When she brought the food to the shed, Nakohe was standing exactly where she had left him, as still as the ancient saguaros that dotted the landscape. She placed the plate on the small table inside. "There are clean clothes as well," she said. "They belong to my husband. They might not fit properly, but they're better than—" She gestured vaguely at his torn buckskins and frayed cotton shirt, the remnants of what must once have been traditional Apache garments. Nakohe's expression remained unreadable, but Elizabeth thought she detected a flicker of something, perhaps pride, perhaps resignation, in his dark eyes. "I'll leave you to rest," she said finally. "We can speak more tomorrow." She turned to go, but his voice stopped her. "Why did you do this?" Elizabeth froze, one hand on the doorframe. How could she explain what she herself didn't fully understand? The moment in the town square had been one of pure instinct, a recognition of something in his bearing that called to something in hers. "I couldn't watch them hurt you," she said simply, not turning around. "It wasn't right." "There are many things that are not right," he replied, "yet they happen all the same." Elizabeth nodded, absorbing the weight of his words. "Yes, they do." She walked back to her house, feeling his gaze on her back until she closed her door. Once inside, she leaned against the rough wood and released a shaky breath. What had she done? Brought a dangerous stranger into her home, or saved a man from injustice? Perhaps both. That night, sleep eluded her. Elizabeth lay awake, listening to the familiar chorus of desert night sounds, wondering if Nakohe was doing the same. Dawn broke with copper fingers stretching across the horizon, painting the schoolhouse in shades of amber and gold. Elizabeth woke with a start, momentarily disoriented. Then the events of the previous day flooded back, and she sat up quickly. She had brought an Apache warrior to her home, a man the entire town feared. She dressed hurriedly, her mind racing through contingencies. Would he still be there? Had he fled in the night? Or worse, was he waiting to ambush her the moment she stepped outside? Elizabeth chided herself for such thoughts. She couldn't save a man from injustice one day, only to suspect him of barbarism the next. Taking a deep breath, she opened her door. The sight that greeted her stilled the air in her lungs. Nakohe was already at work. He had found her husband's old tools and was measuring boards for the fence repair. His movements were precise and methodical, suggesting a familiarity with such labor that surprised her. He had changed into Thomas's old clothes, the faded blue shirt hanging loosely on his frame, but the trousers fitting well enough. The transformation was striking. With his hair tied back and wearing the clothes of a white settler, he almost appeared to belong. Almost. Nothing could disguise the inherent grace with which he moved, nor the alertness in his posture that spoke of a lifetime spent in vigilance. Every few moments, his eyes would scan the horizon, checking, assessing. Even here, he remained a warrior. "Good morning," Elizabeth called, her voice carrying across the yard. Nakohe looked up, nodded once, and returned to his work. Not exactly warm, but not hostile either. Elizabeth reminded herself that she had purchased his labor, not his friendship. She retreated to her kitchen to prepare breakfast, feeling oddly self-conscious. Through the window, she watched him work, noting the efficiency of his movements. By the time she brought out 2 plates of cornbread and bacon, he had already repaired a section of fence that Thomas had been meaning to fix for months before his passing. "You should eat," she said, offering him a plate, "to keep up your strength." He studied the food for a moment before accepting it with a nod. "Thank you." They ate in silence, the morning birds providing the only conversation. When he finished, Nakohe handed her the empty plate and returned to work without a word. The day unfolded in much the same manner. Elizabeth taught her lessons, only 3 students today, as several parents had abruptly decided their children needed help with farm chores, while Nakohe steadily transformed her property. By midday, he had repaired half the fence. By afternoon, he was on the roof, replacing broken shingles with practiced hands. Elizabeth found herself stealing glances at him as she taught. His presence was distracting, not out of fear, but fascination. Who was this man who worked with such quiet determination? What thoughts moved behind those inscrutable eyes? Her youngest student, 8-year-old Emma Tucker, caught her looking and tugged at her sleeve. "Mrs. Hartwell, is that really a wild Indian up there?" Elizabeth winced at the term. "His name is Nakohe," she corrected gently. "And yes, he is Apache. He's helping repair the schoolhouse." Emma's eyes widened. "My papa says Apaches are dangerous, that they kill people." Elizabeth knelt to meet the child's gaze. "Many dangerous things have happened on this frontier, Emma. Harm has come from all kinds of people, white and Indian alike." She chose her words carefully. "Nakohe is working for me now, and you have nothing to fear from him." The child seemed satisfied, but Elizabeth's own words echoed in her mind long after the students had gone home. Did she truly believe Nakohe posed no threat, or was she simply hoping that her act of mercy would be repaid in kind? As the sun began its descent, Nakohe climbed down from the roof. His shirt was dark with sweat, his hands bearing fresh calluses from the day's labor. Elizabeth approached with a dipper of cool water from the well. "You've accomplished more in one day than most men could in a week," she said, offering the water. Nakohe drank deeply, then wiped his mouth with the back of his hand. "The work is not difficult." "Perhaps not for you," Elizabeth replied, "but I'm grateful nonetheless." He studied her face as if searching for deceit. "Why do you live alone? A woman without protection in this place?" The directness of his question caught her off guard. "I'm not entirely alone. I have my students, and the town is just a mile away." "The town that would see me whipped or hanged," he observed. "Would they come if you called?" Elizabeth had no ready answer. The truth was, her position in Broken Ridge had always been somewhat tenuous. As an educated woman from the East, with progressive ideas about equality and native rights, she had never fully integrated into the frontier community. Thomas's standing as a respected carpenter had provided a buffer, but since his death, she had felt the town's tolerance waning. "I manage well enough on my own," she said finally. Nakohe's gaze remained steady. "You have courage," he said, "but little wisdom." Elizabeth bristled at his assessment. "Wisdom enough to save you from a public whipping." A ghost of a smile, the first she had seen, touched his lips. Perhaps, or perhaps merely trading one form of captivity for another. The words hung between them, uncomfortable in their truth. He was not free. He was bound to her by an arrangement only marginally better than prison. "I have no wish to be your captor," Elizabeth said quietly. "Only to provide an alternative to the sheriff's justice." "Justice?" Nakohe repeated the word as if tasting something unfamiliar. "Your people speak often of this thing, yet practice it seldom." Before Elizabeth could respond, the sound of approaching hoofbeats drew their attention. A rider was coming up the trail from town, the familiar figure of Reverend Collins on his dappled grey mare. Elizabeth's stomach tightened with apprehension. Nakohe tensed, his posture shifting subtly from laborer to warrior in an instant. "It's all right," Elizabeth assured him. "He's a friend." Nakohe's expression suggested he doubted the existence of any such thing among white people, but he stepped back, moving to gather the tools scattered around the yard. As the Reverend approached, Elizabeth smoothed her skirts and tucked a loose strand of hair behind her ear, suddenly aware of her disheveled appearance after a day of teaching. Reverend Collins reined his horse to a stop, his gaze traveling from Elizabeth to Nakohe and back again, his usually gentle eyes hard with concern. "Elizabeth," he said, his voice strained with forced pleasantry, "I thought it best to check on your situation." Reverend Collins dismounted with the careful deliberation of a man choosing his next words. He was not a large man, tall but reed thin, with kind eyes that had drawn Elizabeth's respect, if not her affection. Today, however, those eyes held something less charitable as they darted between her and Nakohe. "Mrs. Hartwell," he said, removing his hat, "I've come with the concerns of the congregation." "How thoughtful," Elizabeth replied, striving for a tone of normalcy. "Would you care for some tea?" The Reverend hesitated, then nodded. "That would be welcome, thank you." Elizabeth turned to Nakohe, who stood motionless, his face once again an unreadable mask. "Would you mind finishing the west section of the fence while I speak with Reverend Collins?" Nakohe's gaze flicked to the Reverend, assessing him with the briefest of glances before giving Elizabeth a short nod. He gathered the tools and moved toward the unfinished fence line, his movements deliberately measured as if to appear less threatening. Elizabeth led the Reverend to the small porch, where two weathered chairs faced the setting sun, a spot where she had often sat with Thomas in the early days of their marriage, dreaming of the school they would build together. "I'll bring the tea," she said, disappearing inside before he could object. In the kitchen, her hands trembled slightly as she prepared the pot. She had expected this, the town's judgment delivered through its most respectable messenger, but found herself unexpectedly resentful of the intrusion. She had made her choice. Why should she need to justify it to anyone? When she returned with the tea tray, Reverend Collins was standing at the porch railing, watching Nakohe work. "He seems capable," the Reverend admitted, accepting the cup she offered. "Remarkably so," Elizabeth agreed. "He's accomplished more in one day than I could have in a month." Collins settled into one of the chairs, his discomfort evident in the rigid set of his shoulders. "Elizabeth," he began, using her Christian name with the familiarity he had earned through months of Sunday dinners and thoughtful conversation. "What you did yesterday has caused quite a stir in town." "I imagine it has." Elizabeth sat across from him, smoothing her skirt with one hand. "People are concerned." The Reverend sipped his tea, his eyes still tracking Nakohe's movements. "And frankly, so am I. To have a..." He hesitated, searching for a term. "A man like that, here, alone with you. It's not proper. It's not safe." Elizabeth bristled. Would it be more proper to have watched him whipped in the town square? More Christian, perhaps? Collins had the grace to look discomfited. "The law has its own workings, which are not always for us to question. But that's not why I'm here." He leaned forward, his voice softening. "I'm here because I care for your well-being, Elizabeth. This man is dangerous. Whatever your charitable intentions, you cannot change what he is." "And what is he exactly?" Elizabeth challenged, her voice sharper than she intended. "He's a renegade, a man who has refused the path of peace offered by the reservation." The Reverend set down his cup. "The army reports he led raids on 2 settlements north of here. Men died, Elizabeth." Elizabeth glanced toward Nakohe, who was driving fence posts into the hard ground with powerful, efficient strokes. She had wondered about his past, what he had done, what had been done to him, but had not yet found the courage to ask. "Were there trials for these raids?" she asked. "Evidence presented? Witnesses questioned?" Collins's lips thinned. "You know how things work in the territories. Yes, I do. A native man is presumed guilty of any crime attributed to his people. Actual proof is considered optional. Elizabeth's voice was steady, though her heart raced at her own boldness. The Reverend's expression hardened slightly. I didn't take you for an Indian sympathizer, Elizabeth. I sympathize with justice, she replied. With truth. Is that not what your sermons encourage, Reverend? To seek truth, even when it's uncomfortable. A flush crept up Collins's neck. Truth is that savage has no place in a Christian woman's home. The town is talking, Elizabeth. Talking in ways that will damage your reputation beyond repair. Let them talk. Elizabeth set her cup down with a finality that surprised even her. I've purchased his labor fairly. He's working off his debt to society in a productive manner. I fail to see how this arrangement should concern anyone but myself. The Reverend stood, his patience visibly fraying. Mrs. Pemberley is already questioning whether mothers should send their children to be educated by a woman of questionable judgment. A stab of fear pierced Elizabeth's composure. Her school was everything. Her livelihood, her purpose since Thomas's death. Without students, she would have nothing. I see, she said quietly. Collins's expression softened, sensing her vulnerability. I could speak to the town council, assure them of your continued suitability as a teacher, but I would need to offer them some assurance in return. What kind of assurance? That this situation is temporary, that you'll turn the Indian over to the army post at Fort Wilcox within the week. He hesitated, and perhaps that you are not entirely alone out here. Elizabeth's eyes narrowed. Meaning? Meaning that my offer still stands, Elizabeth. The Reverend's voice dropped to a near whisper. I would be honored to make you my wife, to provide you with protection and respectability, to ensure that no one would ever question your position in this community again. The proposal hung in the air between them, not entirely unexpected, but unwelcome nonetheless. Elizabeth had known of the Reverend's intentions for months. His careful courtship, his gentle persistence despite her polite deflections. He was a good man in his way, kind, respected, the sort of husband most widows in her position would welcome. Yet something in her recoiled at the thought. That's very generous, she managed, but I'm not ready to consider remarriage. Collins's face fell. Elizabeth, and I won't be sending Nakohe to Fort Wilcox, she continued, her resolve hardening with each word. He has committed no crime under my roof. He's fulfilling the terms of our agreement admirably. The Reverend studied her face, a new understanding dawning in his eyes. I see, he said slowly. Perhaps I've misjudged the nature of your interest in this man. Elizabeth felt heat rise to her cheeks. That is entirely inappropriate, Reverend. Is it? He reached for his hat. I pray you know what you're doing, Elizabeth, I truly do. But I fear you've made a grave error in judgment, one that may cost you everything you've built here. He turned to leave, but paused at the steps. The quarterly meeting of the school board is this Friday. I suggest you attend without your laborer. Perhaps you can persuade them of your continued fitness to shape young minds. As the Reverend mounted his horse and rode away, Elizabeth remained on the porch, her tea growing cold beside her. The sun was setting now, painting the sky in fierce shades of crimson and gold. She watched Nakohe working steadily in the fading light, his silhouette stark against the blazing horizon. What had she done? Risked everything for a principle, for a man she didn't even know? Or for something else, something she wasn't ready to name, even to herself? Twilight deepened into dusk as Elizabeth remained on the porch, the Reverend's warning echoing in her mind. She had known there would be consequences, but having them laid bare so bluntly left her shaken. The school was not just her livelihood, it was her purpose, her connection to Thomas's memory, her entire identity in this harsh frontier world. The sound of Nakohe putting away tools finally roused her from her thoughts. He moved with the same quiet efficiency that had marked all his actions, storing each item in its proper place. Even in the fading light, she could see the improvements to her property, the fence standing straight and strong, the roof no longer sagging, the steps to the schoolhouse repaired. "You should come inside," she called, surprising herself. "It's getting dark." Nakohe paused, clearly taken aback by the invitation. After a moment's consideration, he approached the porch, stopping at the bottom step. "The man who was here," he said, "he brings trouble." Elizabeth smiled ruefully. "Reverend Collins would say he brings concern for my spiritual welfare." "It is the same thing," Nakohe replied, his face serious. "Trouble disguised as care." The observation startled a small laugh from Elizabeth. "Perhaps you're right." She gestured to the chair the Reverend had vacated. "Would you like some tea? It's still warm." Nakohe hesitated, then climbed the steps with deliberate slowness, as if giving her time to reconsider the invitation. When she didn't, he lowered himself into the chair, perching on the edge rather than leaning back. Elizabeth poured him a cup, noting how his large, work-roughened hands dwarfed the delicate china, Thomas's mother's wedding set, one of the few fine things she owned. "Thank you," he said, the words still formal on his tongue. He sipped the tea carefully, watching the horizon darken over the rim of the cup. They sat in silence for a time, the cooling evening air carrying the scent of sage and dust. In the distance, a coyote called, its lonely howl answered by another. "The Reverend says you led raids on settlements," Elizabeth said finally, her voice quiet. "That men died." Nakohe set down the teacup, his expression unchanged. "Yes." His simple confirmation startled her. She had half expected denials, explanations, justifications. "Why?" she asked. He turned to look at her directly, his dark eyes reflecting the last light of day. "Why do your people raid our camps, kill our women and children, take our land?" His voice remained steady, not accusatory but matter-of-fact. "It is the way of war." Elizabeth frowned. "But the treaties—" "Paper words," Nakohe interrupted with a dismissive gesture, "made to be broken when convenient. First they say, 'Go to this place, we will leave you in peace.' Then they find gold, silver, good water. Suddenly that place is needed, and we must go somewhere else. Always somewhere else until there is nowhere left." Elizabeth had read accounts in Eastern newspapers of treaty violations and corruption among Indian agents, but hearing it spoken so plainly, without rhetoric or political positioning, struck her differently. "So you fight," she said softly. "I fought," he corrected. "Now I am here." His gaze swept over the homestead, working for a white woman who teaches white children to read white books. There was no bitterness in his voice, merely statement of fact. Yet Elizabeth felt the sting of his words. "I would teach Apache children too if they came," she said. Nakohe's expression softened almost imperceptibly. "Perhaps you would." He set the empty cup on the small table between them. "But they will not come, and soon even your white children may stay away." Elizabeth's breath caught. "You heard." "I hear everything," he replied simply. Of course he did. A warrior's survival would depend on such awareness. She wondered what else he had observed that she hadn't realized. "The school board meets Friday," she said, unsure why she was confiding in him. "They may decide I'm no longer suitable to teach." Nakohe nodded, unsurprised. "Because of me. Because I chose to intervene. Because I—" She trailed off, suddenly unable to articulate exactly what had driven her actions in the town square. "Because you saw me as a man, not an animal to be whipped," Nakohe finished for her. "That is dangerous thinking for a white woman." Elizabeth stared at him, struck by his insight. "Yes," she admitted, "it is." A comfortable silence fell between them, more intimate than any conversation they had yet shared. In the distance, lightning flashed, illuminating the gathering clouds on the horizon. "Storm coming," Nakohe observed. Elizabeth nodded. Summer storms in this part of Arizona could be violent, sweeping in with little warning and unleashing fury upon the parched land. "We should secure everything," she said, rising from her chair. They worked together in the deepening darkness, Nakohe bringing the livestock into the small barn, while Elizabeth closed shutters and brought in items that might blow away. As they finished, the first heavy drops began to fall, quickly becoming a deluge that turned the yard into a sea of mud. They reached the porch just as thunder crashed overhead, so loud it seemed to shake the very foundations of the schoolhouse. Elizabeth gasped, instinctively stepping closer to Nakohe. He remained steady beside her, a solid presence amidst the chaos of the storm. "You should go inside," he said, his voice nearly drowned by the rain hammering on the roof. "What about you? The shed roof still leaks." As if to punctuate her point, lightning split the sky, illuminating the pathetic structure where he had been sleeping. Even from the porch, she could see water already pooling on the floor. Nakohe shrugged. "I have endured worse." Elizabeth made a decision then, one that seemed both reckless and inevitable. "No," she said firmly, "you'll catch your death out there. You can sleep by the kitchen fire tonight." His eyes widened slightly, the only indication of his surprise. "The Reverend would not approve," he said, a hint of wry humor in his tone. "The Reverend is not here," Elizabeth replied, lifting her chin. "And I will not have a man under my care sleeping in a flooded shed when there's a perfectly good hearth inside." Without waiting for his response, she opened the door and stepped into her small home. After a moment's hesitation, Nakohe followed. The interior was simple but comfortable, a main room that served as both kitchen and living area, with a curtained alcove containing her bed. A stone fireplace dominated one wall, embers still glowing from the day's cooking fire. Elizabeth busied herself adding wood, avoiding Nakohe's gaze as he stood just inside the doorway, water dripping from his clothes onto the plank floor. "There are dry clothes in the trunk," she said, gesturing to a cedar chest near the hearth. "More of my husband's. You can change behind the screen." She pointed to a folding wooden screen in the corner, used when she needed privacy from her students. Nakohe hesitated, then moved to the trunk, selecting a simple shirt and trousers. He disappeared behind the screen while Elizabeth retrieved blankets from a cupboard, arranging them near the fire. When he emerged, the domesticity of the scene struck Elizabeth with unexpected force. An Apache warrior, wearing her dead husband's clothes, standing in her kitchen with the firelight casting warm shadows across his face. It was a tableau no one in Broken Ridge could have imagined, least of all herself a week ago. "Thank you," Nakohe said quietly, the words carrying more weight than the simple courtesy they conveyed. Elizabeth nodded, suddenly aware of the intimacy of the situation, the two of them alone in her small home, rain sealing them off from the rest of the world. She should feel afraid, she knew, or at the very least concerned for her reputation should anyone discover this arrangement. Instead, she felt only a strange sense of rightness, as if some invisible thread of destiny had been drawing them to this moment all along. "We should both rest," she said, her voice steadier than she felt. "Tomorrow will bring its own challenges." Nakohe nodded, lowering himself onto the blankets she had arranged. "The spirits bring storms to wash away what came before," he said, "to make the land new again." Elizabeth paused at the entrance to her sleeping alcove. "Is that what you believe?" "It is what I know," he replied, his eyes reflecting the dancing flames. "Sometimes destruction must come before renewal." Outside, The storm raged on, thunder rolling across the desert like the hoofbeats of ghostly horses. But within the small schoolhouse, something fragile and new had begun to take root. An understanding that transcended words, bridging worlds that had seemed irreconcilably separate only days before. Dawn arrived with the gentle afterglow of the storm, a world washed clean, shimmering with droplets that caught the early light like scattered diamonds. Elizabeth woke to the unfamiliar sound of movement in her kitchen. For a disorienting moment, she imagined Thomas had returned, that the last 2 years of widowhood had been merely a terrible dream. Then memory reasserted itself. Nakohe, the storm, her impulsive invitation. She rose quietly, wrapping a shawl around her nightdress, before peering through the curtain that separated her sleeping area from the main room. Nakohe was already dressed in Thomas's work clothes, stoking the fire with practiced movements. On the small table, 2 cups had been set out, steam rising from what appeared to be coffee brewing in her old pot. "Good morning," she said, stepping into the room. Nakohe turned, acknowledging her with a nod. "The rain has stopped," he said, "but the ground is still wet. Good for digging the garden." His practicality in the face of their unusual circumstance steadied her somehow. There was no awkwardness in his manner, no suggestion that the boundaries they had crossed the night before held any special significance. "You made coffee," she observed, moving to the table. "I watched how you did it yesterday," he replied, pouring a cup and offering it to her. "Is it correct?" Elizabeth took a sip, surprised by the perfect strength of the brew. "It's excellent," she said. "Thank you." A ghost of a smile touched his lips, gone almost before she could register it. "I will return to the shed now," he said, "to collect my things." "Of course." Elizabeth nodded, oddly disappointed by his eagerness to re-establish the proper distance between them. "I'll prepare breakfast while you do that." As Nakohe stepped outside, Elizabeth moved to the window, watching him cross the yard to the shed. In the clear morning light, she could see how the storm had transformed her property. The dry, dusty earth had been temporarily tamed, mud puddles reflecting the blue sky, where yesterday there had been only parched soil. The repairs Nakohe had made stood firm against the night's assault, the fence straight and true, the roof no longer leaking. In just 2 days, he had begun to restore what years of neglect had slowly eroded. Elizabeth felt a surge of gratitude that went beyond the simple value of his labor. There was something reassuring in watching skilled hands rebuild what had been broken, something that spoke to a deeper yearning in her soul. The day settled into a rhythm of shared work and careful distance. Elizabeth taught her lessons. Only 2 students today, the Tucker children, whose mother was perhaps less swayed by town gossip than most. While Nakohe tilled the garden soil, his powerful shoulders flexing with each thrust of the spade, Emma Tucker, still fascinated by their unusual guest, peppered Elizabeth with questions throughout the morning. "Does he know how to read, Mrs. Hartwell?" "I don't know, Emma," Elizabeth replied honestly. "Perhaps you should ask him during your lunch break." The child's eyes widened at the suggestion. "I could teach him," she offered with the earnest enthusiasm of youth. "Like you taught my brother when he didn't know his letters," Elizabeth smiled, touched by the girl's innocence. "That's very kind, Emma, but Mr. Nakohe might not want lessons." "Mr. Nakohe," Emma repeated, trying the name on her tongue. "Papa calls him the Injun. Mama told him not to say it that way." Elizabeth's smile faded. "Your mother is right. It's not respectful." "Is he your friend now, Mrs. Hartwell?" Emma persisted. The question gave Elizabeth pause. What was Nakohe to her? Not a servant, though he worked for her, not a friend exactly, though something like understanding had begun to grow between them. Certainly not what Reverend Collins had insinuated with his inappropriate remarks. "He's..." Elizabeth hesitated, searching for the right words. "He's someone who deserves to be treated with dignity, just like everyone else." The answer seemed to satisfy Emma, who returned to her arithmetic with renewed concentration. But the question lingered in Elizabeth's mind throughout the day, resurfacing whenever her gaze drifted to the window where Nakohe worked steadily in the garden. By mid-afternoon, he had prepared 3 neat rows for planting, the rich soil turned and waiting for seed. Elizabeth dismissed her students early, watching them scamper down the path toward town with a mixture of affection and concern. How many more days would the Tucker children be allowed to attend her school? How soon before the town's disapproval emptied her classroom entirely? She was still standing on the porch, lost in thought, when the sound of approaching horses drew her attention. 3 riders were coming up the trail from Broken Ridge, men she recognized immediately. Sheriff Thornton, flanked by his deputy, and Mr. Pembroke, the banker whose wife had been so vocal in her disapproval at the town square. Elizabeth's heart sank. This was not a social call. Nakohe had noticed them too. He straightened from his work, his posture alert but outwardly calm. His eyes met Elizabeth's across the yard, a silent question in their depths. "It's all right," she called to him, hoping she sounded more confident than she felt. "Please continue your work." And the men reined their horses to a stop at the edge of her property. Sheriff Thornton dismounted first, his hand resting casually near his holstered pistol. "Mrs. Hartwell," he called, his tone falsely pleasant. "Fine day after the storm." "Sheriff," Elizabeth acknowledged, descending the steps to meet them. "What brings you gentlemen out this way?" Pembroke remained mounted, looking down at her with poorly disguised contempt. "We've come to check on your arrangement, Mrs. Hartwell, ensuring everything is as it should be." Elizabeth's spine stiffened. "Everything is perfectly fine, Mr. Pembroke. As you can see, Nakohe has been making excellent progress on the repairs." The deputy spat a stream of tobacco juice into a puddle. "That what you call him, by his heathen name?" "I call him by his name, yes," Elizabeth replied evenly, "as I would any man working on my property." Sheriff Thornton's eyes narrowed as he surveyed the improvements to the fence and roof. "Seems you're getting your money's worth, at least." His gaze shifted to Nakohe, who had resumed digging but was clearly monitoring the conversation. "No trouble from him? No inappropriate behavior?" The insinuation in his tone made Elizabeth's cheeks burn. "None whatsoever," she said firmly. "He has been nothing but respectful and hard-working." "Be that as it may," Pembroke interjected, "the town council has concerns, Mrs. Hartwell, grave concerns about the propriety of your situation here." "My situation is entirely proper, Mr. Pembroke. I hired a laborer to perform needed repairs on my property. Nothing more, nothing less." The banker's jowls quivered with indignation. "A single woman, living alone with a savage. There's nothing proper about that." Elizabeth's patience snapped. "I fail to see how my arrangements are the town council's concern. This is my property, purchased legally and maintained through my own efforts since my husband's death. If I choose to hire help, that is my business alone." Sheriff Thornton stepped closer, lowering his voice. "Now, Mrs. Hartwell, no need to get all riled up. We're just looking out for your welfare." "Are you?" Elizabeth challenged. "Or are you looking for an excuse to reclaim what you see as easy money? $300 for a man's freedom seems a bargain to you, doesn't it, Sheriff? Especially when you can simply take him back on the flimsiest pretext." Thornton's expression hardened. "You're treading dangerous ground, ma'am. Very dangerous indeed." "What precisely is the purpose of your visit, gentlemen?" Elizabeth demanded, her voice steady despite the fear coiling in her stomach. Pembroke cleared his throat. "The school board will be meeting tomorrow, as I'm sure you're aware. Given the unusual nature of your living arrangements, there is some question as to your suitability to continue as the town's teacher." "I see," Elizabeth said coldly. "And this visit is meant to intimidate me before that meeting?" "This visit," the banker replied, "is a courtesy, a chance for you to reconsider your position." Reverend Collins has made it clear he would be willing to take the Indian off your hands, to find him more appropriate work under proper supervision. Elizabeth nearly laughed at the transparent attempt to manipulate her. How generous of the Reverend. But my arrangement with Nakohe is between him and me. It's not open to negotiation by third parties. The sheriff's hand moved closer to his pistol, a subtle but unmistakable threat. Way I see it, you paid the county for his labor. If the county, meaning me, determines he's better placed elsewhere, that's our right. That wasn't our agreement, Elizabeth protested. Ain't no written agreement says otherwise, Thornton countered with an ugly smile. Throughout this exchange, Nakohe had continued working, giving no indication that he heard or understood what was being discussed. But Elizabeth saw the tension in his shoulders, the careful way he positioned himself to keep all three visitors in his line of sight. "Gentlemen," she said with forced calm, "I believe you've made your position clear. Now, if you'll excuse me, I have lessons to prepare for tomorrow." Pembroke's face reddened. "This isn't over, Mrs. Hartwell. The board will have its say tomorrow." "I look forward to it," Elizabeth replied, though her stomach twisted at the thought. The men remounted, casting dark looks toward Nakohe as they did so. Sheriff Thornton tipped his hat with mock politeness. "We'll be keeping an eye on things out here," he said, "just to ensure your safety." They rode away, dust rising from their horses' hooves despite the damp ground. Elizabeth remained standing in the yard until they disappeared around the bend, only then allowing her shoulders to sag with the weight of their implied threats. Nakohe approached, wiping earth from his hands onto his trousers. "They will come back," he said quietly. "At night, perhaps, when they think you will not see them coming." Elizabeth turned to him, struck by the certainty in his voice. "You think they mean to take you by force? Or worse?" His eyes met hers, dark and serious. "You have made enemies for my sake, Elizabeth Hartwell. Dangerous men who do not like a woman who speaks her mind." It was the first time he had used her full name, and despite the gravity of the situation, something warm unfurled in her chest at the sound of it on his lips. "What should we do?" she asked, surprising herself with the question. When had they become a we? Nakohe looked toward the horizon, where the sun had begun its descent. "Tonight we will be ready," he said simply. "Tomorrow you will go to your meeting. And then—" His expression softened, a gentleness entering his eyes that she had not seen before. "Then we will see what path the spirits have chosen for us." Dusk settled over the schoolhouse like a whispered warning. Elizabeth moved through her evening routine with mechanical precision, washing dishes, sweeping floors, checking the lamps, all while her mind raced with possibilities, each more troubling than the last. Outside, Nakohe had disappeared shortly after the men's departure, returning an hour later with an armful of branches and what appeared to be sinew cord. Now he sat on the porch steps, fashioning something with nimble fingers, his concentration absolute. Elizabeth brought him a cup of coffee, curious but hesitant to interrupt his work. "What are you making?" she finally asked, sitting beside him at a proper distance. Nakohe's hands never paused. "Alarm," he replied. He gestured toward the path leading to her property. "If they come, we will know." Elizabeth studied the intricate arrangement of twigs, cord, and small stones he was creating. Like a trap, not to hurt, to warn. He glanced up at her, his expression softening slightly. "You should go inside soon, lock the door, and leave you out here alone." Elizabeth shook her head. "I won't hide while you face danger on my behalf." Nakohe's hands stilled. "This is not your fight, isn't it?" Elizabeth challenged. "They threaten me as much as you. My livelihood, my reputation." She paused, gathering courage. "And regardless, I won't abandon you to their justice." He studied her face with an intensity that made her breath catch. "You are a strange woman, Elizabeth Hartwell." "So I've been told," she replied with a wry smile. Something like amusement flickered across his features. In my tribe, such a woman would be respected. Feared perhaps, but respected. And in your tribe, she ventured, what would happen to a man who found himself indebted to such a woman? Nakohe's gaze returned to his work, his fingers resuming their skilled movements. There is no word for it. A warrior is never owned by another. I don't own you, Elizabeth said quickly, the very thought repulsive to her. Don't you? His voice held no accusation, merely inquiry. You paid money for my labor. The law says you may command me. Elizabeth shook her head vehemently. That's not, I never intended. She stopped, frustrated by her inability to articulate the complex tangle of motives and emotions that had driven her actions in the town square. I only wanted to prevent an injustice. And now you face injustice yourself, he observed, because of me. Because of narrow minds and fearful hearts, she corrected, not because of you. Nakohe tied the final knot on his creation and rose to his feet in one fluid movement. I will set these around the perimeter, he said. Stay on the porch. Elizabeth watched as he moved silently into the gathering darkness, placing his warning devices at strategic points around her property. His movements reminded her of a mountain lion she had once glimpsed in the foothills, graceful, purposeful, alert to every shift in the environment. Despite the danger looming on the horizon, she felt oddly safe in his presence. When he returned, the first stars were appearing overhead, pinpricks of silver in the deepening indigo sky. It's a beautiful night, Elizabeth said softly. Hard to believe there's any malice in the world on such an evening. Nakohe followed her gaze upward. My people believe the stars are the campfires of those who have gone before, he said. They watch over us, guide our steps when the path is dark. Elizabeth found herself moved by the image. That's beautiful, she murmured. My husband loved the stars. He knew all the constellations, taught them to me on summer nights like this. You miss him still, Nakohe observed. Yes. Elizabeth wrapped her arms around herself against the cooling night air. He was a good man, kind. He believed in equality between all people, a radical notion in these parts. He would approve of what you did, Nakohe said, not a question but a statement. Elizabeth smiled sadly. Yes, I think he would. Thomas always said principles meant nothing if they weren't tested. She paused, memories washing over her. We came west to build something meaningful, a place where children of all backgrounds could learn together. But after he died, I found myself alone with his dream, in a town that never fully accepted it, or me. Nakohe nodded, understanding in his eyes. It is hard to stand alone between two worlds. The simple truth of his statement struck Elizabeth forcibly. Here was a man who knew exactly what it meant to exist in the space between conflicting realities, perhaps even more profoundly than she did. How did you learn English so well? She asked, suddenly curious about his past. Mission school, Nakohe replied, his tone neutral. When I was a boy, before I ran away to rejoin my people. Elizabeth tried to imagine him as a child, forced into the rigid confines of a mission school, stripped of his language and customs. That must have been difficult. Something like surprise flickered across his face at her understanding. They tried to kill the Apache in me, he said, beat me when I spoke my language, cut my hair, told me my beliefs were evil. His voice remained even, but Elizabeth could sense the old wounds beneath his words. But they could not reach the part that remained free. And now, Elizabeth asked gently, is that part still free? Nakohe's gaze met hers, unexpectedly vulnerable in the fading light. I don't know, he admitted, but last night, when the storm came, I dreamed in my own language for the first time since my capture. The simple confession felt profoundly intimate, a sharing of something precious and private. Elizabeth found herself deeply touched by his trust. "Thank you," she said softly, "for telling me that." A comfortable silence fell between them, broken only by the chorus of night insects and the occasional hoot of a distant owl. The darkness deepened around them, the schoolhouse a small island of lamplight in a sea of shadows. "You should rest," Nakohe said eventually. "Tomorrow will not be easy." "I doubt I could sleep knowing someone might come sneaking onto my property," Elizabeth replied. "I will wake you if there is danger," he assured her. "My people can go days without sleep when necessary." Elizabeth hesitated, reluctant to leave him alone despite his assurances. "At least come inside," she said. "It's getting cold out here." To her surprise, he nodded, following her into the schoolhouse. Inside, the lamp cast a warm glow over the simple furnishings. Elizabeth added wood to the fire, then moved to the small cupboard where she kept her husband's shotgun, rarely used but meticulously maintained. "I can shoot," she said, seeing Nakohe's raised eyebrow. "Thomas insisted I learn." "Another way he was unusual for a white man," Nakohe observed. Elizabeth smiled sadly. "Yes, I suppose so." She checked that the weapon was loaded, then placed it carefully on the table. The clock on the mantel ticked steadily, marking the passage of time as they settled into a watchful vigil. Nakohe positioned himself near the window, where he could observe the approach to the schoolhouse without being easily seen. Elizabeth tried to focus on preparing materials for the next day's lessons, but her attention kept drifting to the man by the window. His profile sharp against the darkness beyond, his stillness almost preternatural. In the lamplight, she could see details she had missed before. The fine lines at the corners of his eyes, speaking of a life lived under harsh sun. The slight unevenness of his nose, suggesting it had been broken and reset. The graceful strength of his hands resting lightly on the windowsill. Not for the first time, she wondered about his life before their paths crossed. The family he might have, the experiences that had shaped him into the man who now stood guard in her home. "Do you have children?" she asked suddenly. "A wife?" Nakohe turned slightly, his expression unreadable. "I had a woman," he said after a long pause. "Nyenesgani took her 3 winters ago. Fever from the white man's blankets." Elizabeth's heart ached at the simple statement, understanding that Nyenesgani was likely an Apache spirit associated with death. "I'm sorry," she said softly. He acknowledged her sympathy with a slight nod. "She was strong, proud. Like you." The comparison startled Elizabeth. "Me? I'm not—" "You stand against your own people for what you believe," Nakohe interrupted. "That takes strength." Before Elizabeth could respond, a soft, almost imperceptible sound came from outside, the warning system Nakohe had placed. His posture changed instantly, tension coiling through his body as he moved away from the window. "Someone comes," he whispered, gesturing for Elizabeth to extinguish the lamp. Her heart hammering, she quickly blew out the flame, plunging the room into darkness, broken only by the faint glow of the banked fire. Nakohe moved to her side, his presence reassuring despite the danger. "How many?" she whispered. "At least 2, he replied, his breath warm against her ear. "Moving quietly, not friends." Elizabeth reached for the shotgun, her hands steady despite her fear. Nakohe touched her arm, a gesture of restraint. "Wait," he murmured. "Let them show themselves first." They stood in tense silence, listening to the nearly imperceptible sounds of movement outside. Elizabeth's eyes gradually adjusted to the darkness, making out Nakohe's form beside her, alert and poised for action. A shadow passed by the window, someone creeping along the side of the schoolhouse, then another, footsteps on the porch, barely audible but unmistakable to ears straining for any sound. The doorknob turned slowly, testing the lock. Elizabeth's breath caught in her throat as the wood creaked under pressure. Then a whispered voice from outside. "It's locked. Think she's asleep?" "Doesn't matter. Sheriff said just to scare her. Maybe rough up the Indian a bit if we get the chance." Elizabeth's hand tightened on the shotgun, anger flaring hot in her chest. Nakohe's hand found hers in the darkness, a silent communication. "Steady. Wait. Listen." "What if she wakes up?" the first voice asked, uncertainty evident in his tone. "Then we tell her it's for her own good," the second replied, "that no decent white woman should be alone with a savage." More movement, the sound of something scraping against the wall. Elizabeth smelled smoke, and a new fear seized her. Were they planning to burn her out? Nakohe sensed her alarm. "The woodpile," he whispered. "They're near it. Give me the gun." Elizabeth hesitated only a moment before passing him the weapon. In the faint light from the dying fire, she saw him check the ammunition, then move toward the back door with silent efficiency. "Stay here," he instructed, his voice barely audible. Before she could protest, he had slipped outside, leaving her alone in the darkened house. Elizabeth pressed herself against the wall beside the window, heart pounding so loudly she was certain the intruders must hear it. Seconds stretched into minutes with excruciating slowness. Then from the side of the house came a tremendous crash, followed by shouting and the sound of running feet. A single shotgun blast split the night, its report echoing across the property. Elizabeth ran to the door, fear for Nakohe overriding caution. She flung it open just as he appeared on the porch, shotgun still in hand. "They're gone," he said, lowering the weapon. "I fired into the air. They won't return tonight." Relief flooded through her, followed immediately by concern. "Are you hurt?" "No." He handed her the shotgun, "but they will tell others what happened. Tomorrow will be worse." Elizabeth nodded, understanding the implication. The incident would be twisted, exaggerated, an Indian with a gun threatening white men. The school board would have all the ammunition they needed. "Come inside," she said quietly. "We should both try to rest while we can." As they re-entered the house, Elizabeth relit the lamp with hands that finally betrayed a slight tremor. The warm light revealed Nakohe's face, composed but alert, his eyes meeting hers with an intensity that made her heart skip. "Thank you," she said simply, "for protecting my home." "Our home," he replied, the words so soft she almost missed them. "For tonight, at least." Something shifted between them in that moment, an acknowledgement of a connection that defied easy categorization. Not captor and captive, not employer and laborer, but something far more complex and profound. Elizabeth felt it like a physical presence in the room, this unspoken understanding. And as she looked into Nakohe's eyes, she knew with sudden clarity that whatever came tomorrow, neither of them would ever be the same. Morning arrived with merciless brilliance, the Arizona sun burning away the night's shadows as if to deny the darkness had ever existed. Elizabeth stood before her small mirror, pinning her hair with unsteady fingers. She had chosen her best dress for the school board meeting, a modest navy blue with a high collar and jet buttons down the front. Thomas had always said it brought out the determination in her eyes. Today, she would need every ounce of that determination. Nakohe watched her preparations from the doorway, his face grave. Neither had slept much after the intruder's departure, spending the remaining hours of darkness in quiet conversation, broken by long, comfortable silences. During those hours, something fundamental had shifted between them, a trust born of shared danger, a connection that transcended the circumstances of their meeting. "You don't have to go," Nakohe said, his voice low. "We could leave this place before they come for us." Elizabeth paused, hairpins suspended in midair. The suggestion sent an unexpected thrill through her. The image of the two of them leaving everything behind, seeking some place where they might exist without judgment, But that was fantasy, not reality. "I can't run," she replied, securing the final pin. "This school is all I have, and if I flee, it only confirms what they believe, that I've done something shameful." Nakohe studied her reflection in the mirror, his expression softening. "You have great courage," he said, "but these people have already decided your fate." "Perhaps." Elizabeth turned to face him directly. "But I must at least force them to speak their prejudice aloud, to acknowledge what they're truly doing." She gathered her reticule and gloves, then hesitated. "You'll be here when I return?" The question revealed her deeper fear, that in her absence the sheriff might come to reclaim Nakohe, that she would return to find him gone, dragged away to some worse fate than the one from which she had saved him. "I will be here," he promised, the certainty in his voice settling something within her. "But you should take this." He extended his hand, revealing a small object that gleamed dully in the morning light, a polished stone pendant on a leather cord, etched with symbols she didn't recognize. "What is it?" she asked, accepting it with careful hands. "Protection," he replied simply. "My mother gave it to me when I was a boy. It carries the strength of my ancestors." Elizabeth was stunned by the gesture, the offering of something so personal, so sacred. "I can't take this," she protested. "It's too precious." "Which is why you must take it." His fingers briefly touched hers as he closed her hand around the pendant. "To remind you that you do not stand alone today." The intensity of his gaze made her breath catch. In that moment, Elizabeth acknowledged to herself what she had been avoiding, that her feelings for this man had grown into something far more profound than compassion or even friendship. "Thank you," she whispered, slipping the cord around her neck and tucking the pendant beneath her collar where it rested warm against her skin. The walk to town seemed both interminable and too brief. Elizabeth rehearsed arguments in her mind, planning defenses against accusations she could anticipate. But beneath the logical preparations ran a current of emotion she could scarcely contain. Fear, yes, but also a strange, fierce joy at the knowledge that whatever happened today, something precious had been found amid the chaos of recent days. Broken Ridge appeared unchanged as she approached, the main street drowsing in the morning heat. Yet Elizabeth sensed an undercurrent of anticipation, as if the entire town held its breath. Faces appeared in windows as she passed. Conversations halted on porches. She kept her head high, her steps measured, refusing to hurry despite the hostile scrutiny. The school board meeting was being held in the church, the largest building in town. As Elizabeth climbed the steps, she noted that far more people than usual had gathered. Not just the board members, but what appeared to be half the town's population, crowded into pews designed for Sunday worship. Reverend Collins stood at the pulpit, his expression grave as he watched her enter. Beside him sat the 5 school board members, Mr. Pembroke, Mrs. Whitaker, Dr. Fleming, Mr. Tucker, Emma's father, and old Mrs. Grady, whose 3 sons had all been taught by Elizabeth when she first arrived in Broken Ridge. Sheriff Thornton leaned against the wall near the door, arms crossed over his chest, a satisfied smirk playing at the corners of his mouth. Elizabeth avoided his gaze, focusing instead on the empty chair placed facing the board, the seat of judgment awaiting her. "Mrs. Hartwell," Reverend Collins called as she approached, his voice carrying through the hushed room. "Thank you for joining us." In the formality of his tone told her everything she needed to know about the proceedings' likely outcome. This was not a discussion, it was a sentencing. "Reverend," she acknowledged with a nod, taking the solitary chair. "Members of the board." Pembroke cleared his throat, shuffling papers importantly. "Mrs. Hartwell, this emergency session of the Broken Ridge School Board has been called to address certain concerns about your continued suitability as the town's teacher." "Yes, Mr. Pembroke, so I've been informed." Elizabeth replied evenly, though I confess I'm surprised to see so many in attendance for what I understood to be a board matter. Her gaze swept the crowded pews, noting the mix of expressions, hostility, curiosity, and in some faces a hint of sympathy quickly disguised. The education of our children is everyone's concern, Mrs. Hartwell, Reverend Collins interjected. The community has a right to be present when such important matters are discussed. Indeed, Elizabeth agreed, though I wonder if all community concerns receive such thorough attention, or only those involving a widowed schoolteacher. A murmur rippled through the assembly. Mrs. Whitaker, a pinch-faced woman whose distaste for Elizabeth predated the current controversy, leaned forward. Let us dispense with pleasantries, Mrs. Hartwell. You have brought an Apache warrior, a known renegade, into your home. You are living alone with this savage, without proper supervision or chaperone. Such behavior is not merely improper, it endangers the moral development of the children in your care. Elizabeth felt heat rise to her cheeks, not from shame but indignation. Mr. Nakohe is working on my property, repairing damage that has gone unaddressed since my husband's death. He sleeps in the shed behind the schoolhouse. The lie came easily, justified by the greater truth it protected. There is nothing improper in our arrangement. That's not what my men reported last night, Sheriff Thornton called from his position by the door. They saw lights in your house well after midnight, saw the Indian moving freely about your property, handling a firearm. Another murmur, louder this time, swept through the crowd. Elizabeth's fingers found the pendant beneath her collar, drawing strength from its presence. Your men, Sheriff, were trespassing on my property in the dark of night, she countered, her voice steady despite the anger coursing through her. Mr. Nakohe was protecting my home from intruders, as any decent man would do. Protecting you? Mrs. Whitaker's voice dripped with insinuation. Is that what you call it? Elizabeth turned to face her directly. Yes, Mrs. Whitaker, that is precisely what I call it. Protection from men who feel entitled to frighten a woman living alone because they disapprove of her choices. Mr. Tucker shifted uncomfortably in his seat. Mrs. Hartwell, no one disputes your right to hire help for your property. It's the nature of the person you've chosen that concerns us. The nature? Elizabeth repeated. Do you mean his skill with carpentry? His knowledge of desert plants? His ability to speak 2 languages? Or is it merely the color of his skin that troubles this board? Now see here, Pembroke blustered, face reddening. This has nothing to do with... It has everything to do with prejudice, Elizabeth interrupted, rising to her feet. The pendant seemed to pulse against her skin, filling her with a courage that surprised even her. If I had hired a white man to repair my roof, would we be gathered here today? Would you be questioning my morality or my fitness to teach? A white man wouldn't have butchered settlers, someone called from the pews. Elizabeth turned to face the congregation. Have any of you spoken with Nakohe? Asked him his story? Learned why he fights? She looked from face to face, challenging them. Or is it easier to believe he's a mindless savage, because that justifies taking his land, destroying his way of life? This isn't about politics, Mrs. Hartwell, Reverend Collins said, his tone conciliatory but firm. It's about what's best for the children of this community. Is prejudice best for them? Elizabeth demanded. Is teaching them to fear and hate those who differ from themselves? The Reverend's expression hardened. What you call prejudice, others call prudence. The Apache have killed white settlers. That is fact, not prejudice. And white settlers have killed Apache, Elizabeth countered. Also fact. The cycle of violence continues because neither side sees the humanity in the other. She turned back to the board. I became a teacher because I believe education can break that cycle, that children can learn to see beyond fear, beyond hatred. Noble sentiments, Pembroke said dismissively. But they don't change the impropriety of your living situation. Elizabeth squared her shoulders. Then let me be perfectly clear, Mr. Pembroke. There is nothing improper in my relationship with Nakohe. He works for me during daylight hours, performing tasks I cannot manage alone. He sleeps in separate quarters. Again, the necessary lie. If you choose to remove me from my position because of unfounded rumors and small-town gossip, that is your prerogative. But at least have the honesty to admit it's not about propriety. It's about fear of what you don't understand. A heavy silence fell over the church. Elizabeth could feel the weight of dozens of stares, the judgment hovering in the air like storm clouds. Her heart pounded, but she remained standing, refusing to show weakness. Finally, Mrs. Grady cleared her throat. The oldest member of the board, she had said nothing until now, her rheumy eyes observing the proceedings with enigmatic interest. "I'd like to ask Mrs. Hartwell a direct question, if I may," she said, her voice quavering with age but clear in purpose. "Of course, Mrs. Grady," Elizabeth replied, turning to the elderly woman with genuine respect. Mrs. Grady leaned forward, her gnarled hands folded on the table before her. "Do you love him?" The question, so direct, so unexpected, struck Elizabeth like a physical blow. A shocked hush fell over the assembly as all eyes fixed on her face, awaiting her answer. Elizabeth's mind raced. To deny it would be a lie. She knew now with crystal clarity what her feelings for Nakohe had become. But to admit it would seal her fate, confirm every accusation leveled against her. She touched the pendant at her throat, feeling its subtle warmth. Nakohe had given her his protection, his trust. She would not repay that with dishonesty, no matter the cost. "Yes," she said simply, her voice soft but clear in the hushed church. "Not in the way you're implying, Mrs. Grady, not in any way that compromises my duties as a teacher, but I have come to care deeply for him as a human being, to respect his dignity and his courage." She paused, gathering strength for what came next. "And if that makes me unfit to teach your children, then I accept your judgment." For a moment no one spoke. Then Mrs. Grady nodded slowly, a smile touching her wrinkled lips. "Thank you for your honesty, my dear. It's refreshing in a town built on comfortable lies." Before anyone could respond to this startling statement, the church doors burst open. Deputy Jenkins stood in the doorway, breathing heavily as if he'd run from the sheriff's office. "Sheriff," he called urgently, "telegram from Fort Wilcox. Army patrol's been attacked 10 miles east, 6 dead." Sheriff Thornton straightened, instantly alert. "Apache?" Jenkins nodded grimly. "Scouts tracked them heading this way. Colonel's mobilizing troops, but they're asking for volunteers." A ripple of fear passed through the crowd. Pembroke half rose from his seat. "Here! They're coming here!" "Not if we head 'em off," Thornton replied, already moving toward the door. "I need every man who can shoot, now." The meeting dissolved into chaos as men surged toward the exit. Women gathered children close, and the board members exchanged looks of alarm. Elizabeth stood frozen, a terrible suspicion forming in her mind. The timing was too perfect, the announcement too convenient. She pushed through the crowd, catching Jenkins by the sleeve before he could follow Thornton outside. "Is it true?" she demanded in a low voice. "About the Apache attack?" The deputy's eyes shifted away from hers, unable to hold her gaze. "Sheriff got word this morning," he muttered. "Said to wait till the meeting was nearly done to bring the news." "And the army patrol? The dead soldiers?" Jenkins shrugged, a flicker of discomfort crossing his face. "Sheriff's got his reasons, ma'am. That's all I know." He pulled away, hurrying after Thornton, leaving Elizabeth standing alone in the rapidly emptying church, her suspicion hardening into certainty. There was no Apache attack, no dead soldiers. It was a a pretext for Thornton to gather armed men, and she knew exactly where they were headed. "Nakohe," she whispered, her blood turning to ice in her veins. Without another thought, Elizabeth gathered her skirts and ran toward the door, praying she wasn't already too late. Elizabeth ran as she had never run before, her skirts clutched in white-knuckled fists, her breath coming in ragged gasps. The mile between town and her schoolhouse stretched endlessly before her, each step a desperate prayer that she would not be too late. Behind her she could hear the commotion of men gathering, horses being saddled, rifles being distributed. Sheriff Thornton's voice carried on the wind, issuing orders with the authority of a man who believed justice and his own will were one and the same. "Aim to wound if possible," he called. "Army'll pay more for a live renegade than a dead one." The cold calculation in his tone spurred Elizabeth to greater speed. This had never been about justice or propriety or the safety of Broken Ridge. It had been about money, power, and the hatred that festered in the heart of a small frontier town. The pendant Nakohe had given her bounced against her collarbone as she ran, its weight a reminder of what was at stake, not just a man's freedom, but his very life. A life that had become inexplicably, irrevocably entwined with her own. As the schoolhouse came into view, Elizabeth felt a surge of desperate hope. Everything appeared peaceful. The repaired fence standing straight and true, the new roof shingles gleaming in the midday sun. Nakohe was in the garden, his back to her, as he worked the soil with methodical patience. "Nakohe!" she called, her voice breaking with urgency. "They're coming!" He turned, instantly alert, his eyes finding hers across the yard. In that brief glance, she saw he understood everything, the danger, the betrayal, the choice that now lay before them. Without a word, he dropped his tools and moved toward her with swift purpose, meeting her at the gate as she stumbled to a halt, gasping for breath. The sheriff, she managed between desperate inhalations, made up a story about an Apache attack, gathering men with guns, coming here. Nakohe's face hardened, though no surprise registered in his expression. He had expected this, she realized, perhaps had been expecting it all along. "How many?" he asked, already guiding her toward the house with gentle urgency. "At least a dozen, maybe more." Elizabeth pressed a hand to her side, wincing at the stitch that burned there. "Thornton's leading them. Said something about the army paying for a live renegade." A shadow passed across Nakohe's features. "The reservation agent offers bounties to return escaped Apache, dead or alive." The casual brutality of the system struck Elizabeth anew, igniting a fresh wave of outrage. "We have to leave," she said, "now, before they arrive." Nakohe studied her face, his dark eyes grave. "We?" The single word hung between them, weighted with meaning. Elizabeth swallowed hard, suddenly aware of what she was proposing, abandoning everything, throwing her lot in with a man the entire territory considered an enemy. "Yes," she said, the certainty in her voice surprising even her. "We." Something shifted in Nakohe's expression, a softening, a wonder quickly masked by practical concerns. "There is little time. Take only what cannot be replaced." Elizabeth nodded, rushing into the schoolhouse while Nakohe moved with efficient speed to gather supplies. Inside, she grabbed Thomas's satchel, filling it with essentials. The deed to the property, the small box containing her wedding ring and her mother's locket, a handful of coins kept hidden beneath a loose floorboard. She hesitated at the shelf of books, running her fingers along their spines in a gesture of farewell. So much would be left behind. As she turned to leave, her gaze fell on Thomas's portrait, watching her with painted eyes that seemed to hold a question. Would he understand what she was about to do? Would he forgive her? "I'm sorry," she whispered, touching the frame gently. "But you always said one must live by their principles, whatever the cost." Outside, Nakohe had already saddled her mare and was securing a bundle of provisions behind the saddle. He had changed back into his Apache clothing, the buckskin pants and shirt she had first seen him wearing, now mended and clean. "We must ride east," he said as she emerged from the house. "Away from town, away from the fort. There are places in the mountains where they cannot follow." Elizabeth nodded, handing him the satchel to secure with the other supplies. As he worked, she became aware of a distant sound. Hoofbeats approaching fast from the direction of Broken Ridge. "They're coming," she whispered, fear tightening around her heart. Nakohe finished his task and turned to her, his expression grave but determined. "Elizabeth," he said, using her name with a tenderness that made her breath catch. "You can still change your mind. Stay. Tell them I forced you to help me escape. They would believe it." "No." She shook her head vehemently. "I won't lie to save myself. Not about this." Something like pride flickered in his eyes. He stepped closer, one hand rising to touch her cheek, with a gentleness that belied his warrior's strength. "Then we must be ready to ride hard and far." The thunder of approaching horses grew louder. Moments only remained before Thornton and his men would crest the rise and descend upon the schoolhouse. Elizabeth moved toward the mare, prepared to mount, when the sound of a child's voice froze her in place. "Mrs. Hartwell! Mrs. Hartwell!" Emma Tucker was running across the yard, her small face flushed with exertion, her eyes wide with excitement. Behind her, at a more sedate pace, walked her father, Mr. Tucker, the school board member who had seemed least convinced of Elizabeth's supposed impropriety. "Emma?" Elizabeth gasped, instinctively stepping in front of Nakohe as if to shield him. "You shouldn't be here. It's not safe." The child skidded to a halt, confusion replacing excitement as she noticed the saddled horse, the bundles of supplies. "Are you going somewhere?" Before Elizabeth could formulate a response, Mr. Tucker reached them, slightly out of breath from trying to keep up with his daughter. He looked from Elizabeth to Nakohe and back again, understanding dawning in his weathered face. "You heard about the sheriff's plan," he said simply. Elizabeth nodded, tense and wary. "Mr. Tucker, please take Emma home. What's about to happen is no sight for a child." Tucker's expression softened unexpectedly. "That's why I'm here, Mrs. Hartwell, to warn you." He glanced at Nakohe, who stood alert but non-threatening beside Elizabeth. "Sheriff's gathered quite a force. Says he's going to arrest the Indian for escaping custody, maybe add charges about those intruders last night." "It's a lie," Elizabeth said fiercely. "Nakohe hasn't escaped anything, and those men last night were trespassing on my property." "I believe you," Tucker replied, surprising her. "My Emma hasn't stopped talking about how Mr. Nakohe fixed the schoolhouse roof, how gentle he was with that injured sparrow she found." He looked at his daughter with quiet pride. "Children see clearer sometimes than we do." Papa said not everyone at the meeting believed the bad things they said about you," Emma piped up, her innocent honesty cutting through the tension. "Mrs. Grady told the sheriff he ought to be ashamed, making up stories about Indians to scare everyone." Hope flared briefly in Elizabeth's chest. "There are others who don't believe Thornton's lies." Tucker nodded. "More than you might think, but not enough to stop what's coming." He looked toward the road, where dust clouds signaled the posse's imminent arrival. "You need to go now." "Why are you helping us?" Nakohe asked, speaking for the first time since the Tucker's arrival. Tucker's expression turned grave. "Because I fought in the war, saw what hatred can do to men's souls, and because my daughter needs a world better than the one we've built here." He extended his hand to Nakohe, a gesture so unexpected it momentarily startled the Apache warrior. "Go with God, both of you." After a heartbeat's hesitation, Nakohe clasped the offered hand. No words were exchanged, but something profound passed between the two men. a recognition, an acknowledgement of shared humanity that transcended the divisions of race and history. The moment was broken by the unmistakable sound of riders cresting the hill. Elizabeth turned to see Sheriff Thornton leading at least 15 men toward the schoolhouse, rifles gleaming in the afternoon sun. "Go," Tucker urged, taking Emma's hand and pulling her back. "We'll delay them as best we can." Elizabeth felt tears spring to her eyes as she quickly embraced Emma, then straightened to face Tucker. "Thank you," she whispered, "for everything." Nakohe was already mounting the mare, extending his hand to Elizabeth. She took it without hesitation, allowing him to pull her up behind him. The solid warmth of his back against her chest felt right, as if she had found a place she had been searching for all along. "Hold tight," he said over his shoulder, as she wound her arms around his waist. The mare sprang forward at his urging, racing away from the schoolhouse, not toward the east as they had planned, but toward the north, where a narrow ravine offered a route invisible from the main road. Behind them, Elizabeth heard shouting, Tucker's voice raised in apparent argument with the sheriff, buying them precious seconds. Wind tore at her hair as they galloped, pins flying free until her auburn tresses streamed behind her like a banner. The sensation was terrifying and exhilarating at once, the physical embodiment of the freedom she had chosen, with all its danger and uncertainty. They had nearly reached the ravine when the first shots rang out. Bullets whined past them, kicking up dirt to the left of the mare's pounding hooves. Nakohe leaned low over the horse's neck, urging greater speed, and Elizabeth pressed herself against his back, making herself as small a target as possible. More shots followed, closer this time. Elizabeth heard Thornton's voice, distant but clear. $500 to the man who stops them. The ravine loomed ahead, a narrow slash in the earth that would provide cover from the gunfire, but present its own dangers. Loose shale, hidden drop-offs, the possibility of being trapped with no exit. Yet it was their only chance. Just as they reached the entrance to the ravine, a bullet found its mark. Not in them, but in the mare, striking her hindquarter with a sickening thud. The horse screamed in pain, but continued galloping, blood darkening her dappled flank. "She's hit!" Elizabeth cried, her heart breaking for the faithful animal. "She will carry us as far as she can," Nakohe replied grimly. "Then we continue on foot." The ravine swallowed them, its high walls cutting off the sight of their pursuers, though not the sounds, hoofbeats, shouting, the occasional crack of a rifle as a frustrated rider fired blindly into the narrow passage. The mare's pace had slowed, her breathing labored, but she continued forward with the stubborn courage of her kind. For what seemed like hours, but was perhaps only 20 minutes, they followed the twisting course of the ravine as it climbed steadily upward into the foothills. Behind them, the sounds of pursuit grew fainter. The narrow passage forced riders to proceed single file, slowing Thornton's posse considerably. Finally, as the ravine widened into a small hidden valley sheltered by towering pines, the mare stumbled and would go no further. Nakohe dismounted quickly, helping Elizabeth down before turning his attention to the exhausted horse. He examined the wound with gentle hands, murmuring soothing words in Apache. The bullet had passed through the muscle of the hindquarter, painful but not immediately fatal if properly treated. "Can she recover?" Elizabeth asked, stroking the mare's sweat-dampened neck. "With rest, yes," Nakohe replied, "but she cannot carry us further today." He unsaddled the horse and removed their supplies, then led her to a small stream that trickled through the valley. After ensuring she could drink and graze, he returned to Elizabeth, who stood gazing back the way they had come, listening for signs of pursuit. "They will not find this place before nightfall," he assured her. "And in darkness, they will not risk these heights." Elizabeth nodded, feeling the enormity of their situation settling over her like a physical weight. They had escaped for now, but what came next? Where could they go? How would they survive? As if sensing her thoughts, Nakohe touched her arm lightly. "We should rest while we can. Tomorrow's journey will be difficult." They made a simple camp beneath the shelter of a massive pine, using skills Nakohe had honed through a lifetime in the wilderness. A small, nearly smokeless fire provided warmth against the evening chill. Water from the stream quenched their thirst. Strips of dried meat and a handful of parched corn from Nakohe's provisions satisfied immediate hunger. As twilight deepened into night, Elizabeth found herself staring into the dancing flames, overwhelmed by the irrevocable nature of the choice she had made. Everything familiar was gone: her home, her profession, her place in society. In their stead was this: a mountain valley, a wounded horse, and a man society had taught her to fear, but whom her heart had come to cherish. "Do you regret it?" Nakohe asked quietly, reading her expression with uncanny accuracy. Elizabeth looked up, meeting his gaze across the small fire. "No," she said with simple honesty. "I regret the necessity, but not the choice itself." He nodded, understanding in his eyes. "The path ahead will not be easy." "Few worthwhile paths are," she replied, surprising herself with the certainty she felt. "Where will we go from here?" Nakohe's gaze turned northward, toward mountains that rose like purple shadows against the star-strewn sky. "There are places in the high country where neither white man nor Apache venture often. Places where a person might live free, if they have the courage and skill." "And after that?" Elizabeth asked. "We cannot hide in the wilderness forever." A hint of a smile touched his lips. "Perhaps not forever. There are towns farther west, places where a man's past matters less than his willingness to work, where a woman of learning might find purpose." The image was tantalizing. A new beginning in some distant settlement where they might simply be a man and a woman, free from the weight of history and prejudice. It seemed an impossible dream, yet Elizabeth found herself reaching for it with both hands. "Would we be husband and wife in this new place?" she asked boldly, her cheeks warming at her own forwardness. Nakohe's expression softened, vulnerability showing in his eyes for the first time since she had known him. "Among my people, a man and woman who choose each other make their own ceremony, witnessed by the spirits of earth and sky." He hesitated, then added quietly, "But I would stand before your God as well, if that is what you wish." Elizabeth's heart swelled with emotion too complex for simple naming. "I wish for us to honor both traditions," she said, "to create something new from what each of us brings to the other." He reached across the space between them, taking her hand in his. His palm was warm and calloused against hers, the touch gentle yet strong, like the man himself. "Then let us begin now," he said, his voice deepening. "Under these stars, beside this fire, I choose you, Elizabeth Hartwell, to walk beside me through whatever paths the spirits set before us." Tears sprang to Elizabeth's eyes, not of sorrow, but of a joy so fierce it bordered on pain. "And I choose you, Nakohe, to walk beside me through all that lies ahead, in darkness and in light." He drew her to her feet and around the small fire until they stood face to face, hands clasped between them. In his eyes, she saw reflected the same wonder she felt, that amid chaos and danger, amid prejudice and violence, they had found each other across a divide that had seemed uncrossable. "My people believe that souls who are meant to find each other will do so, no matter what obstacles stand in their way," Nakohe said softly. "Perhaps the spirits led you to that town square for a purpose greater than either of us understood." "Perhaps they did," Elizabeth agreed, thinking of how compelled she had felt in that moment, as if some force beyond herself had pushed her forward to speak those fateful words. "Don't hurt him. I'll buy him." Nakohe released one of her hands to touch the pendant she still wore, his fingers brushing against the hollow of her throat. "This carries the protection of my ancestors," he said. "Now it carries my heart as well." Elizabeth covered his hand with her own, feeling the steady beat of her pulse beneath his fingers. "And you have mine," she whispered, "now and always." He lowered his head slowly, giving her time to draw away if she wished. But Elizabeth rose to meet him, her free hand coming to rest against his chest as their lips met in a kiss that held both tenderness and promise, the first delicate step into a future they would build together. Above them, the stars wheeled in their eternal dance, indifferent to human categories and boundaries. Below, in the ravine they had traveled, the last echoes of pursuit faded into silence as Thornton's men gave up the search until morning. And in the small valley sheltered by ancient pines, a schoolteacher and a warrior slept side by side beneath a shared blanket, their hands still entwined even in dreams. Tomorrow would bring its own challenges, the continuation of their journey, the decisions about where to go and how to live, the ongoing danger from those who would deny their right to choose each other. But for this night, at least, they had found a moment of peace, a small victory in the greater battle for a world where love might transcend the arbitrary lines drawn by fear and history. It was enough. It was everything. In the gentle light of dawn, they would rise together and continue their journey toward that distant, beckoning horizon where freedom waited. Not as an abstract concept, but as the simple, profound right to determine their own path, to love according to the dictates of their hearts, to build something new from the broken pieces of what had come before. And in this, perhaps, lay the greatest revolution of all.